My name is Simon Kemp. I teach French at Somerville College in Oxford, and I'm going to be talking about time and tense. So time and tense are two concepts which are very closely related, so much so that in French they have the same word. Le temps is both time and also the tense of a verb. And by looking at the way tense is used in a literary text, you can understand quite a lot of things about the way that the chronology works in the tense, the situation that's being described in the story, and various other effects that can also be expressed through the use of tense. So first of all, here are two extracts from texts on the A-level syllabus. We have a couple of sentences from Joseph Joffre's Un sac de billes, and we have a line from Albert Camus' L'Étranger. So first of all, I'll just read them out to you. The Joseph Joffre, the first sentence says, La bille roule entre mes doigts au fond de ma poche. C'est celle que je préfère, je la garde toujours, celle-là. The marble rolls between my fingers, deep in my pocket. It's the one that I prefer. I always keep that one. Le 10 septembre, un train s'arrêta à la gare et un millier d'Allemands en descendirent. On the 10th of September, a train stopped at the station and 1,000 Germans got off it. And then from L'Étranger, j'ai crispé ma main sur le revolver, la gâchette a cédé. I tensed my hand on the revolver, the trigger gave way. So these are the tenses which French literature normally uses in order to recount events, to say what happened and then what happened next. You do occasionally get experimental novels using other tenses, but by and large, these are the three choices you've got. So I've highlighted the verbs in bold and in colour. You can see in the first sentence, we've got the three verbs roule, préfère, and garde. And those three are all in the present tense, the présent. In the second sentence, the verbs in blue are s'arrêta and descendir, which are in the passé simple, the past historic tense. That might be the tense which is least familiar to most of you. It tends to be the tense you learn last when you're learning French in school, because it's the tense which is only used in literature, only used in writing, never used in speaking, and so for that reason they tend to keep it for the last one. But unfortunately, it's also the most commonly used tense to tell stories in French. And then lastly, from L'Étranger, j'ai crispé ma main sur le revolver, la gâchette a cédé. That est crispé and a cédé there are the perfect tense, the passé composé. So the choice of tense affects how the story feels to the reader. There's not a massive difference between them, but there is some subtlety, some nuance between the three of them. So first of all, the passé simple is, as I said, the most common tense for telling stories, so that makes it more or less the default. If you're recounting a story, that is your go-to tense, s'arrêta, descendir. It's very much equivalent to the simple past, the past historic tense that most stories are written with in English. The passé composé, j'ai crispé, la gâchette a cédé, in terms of the meaning of it, it has precisely the same meaning as the passé simple. So they both suggest events happening in the past in the way that that stories are normally told. However, the difference is that the passé simple s'arrêta is a tense normally used in writing, and the passé composé, j'ai crispé, is a tense normally used in speaking. So by choosing to use a spoken tense rather than a written tense, Albert Camus gives the impression almost as if Meursault were there telling us the story in his own words. So it gives a feeling of ordinary speech to the story. It gives a feeling of honesty and sincerity, almost as if Meursault were there making the story up as he went along. And if you know the story of L'Étranger, you'll see that fits very well with the representation of Meursault as someone who is a very honest, straightforward person. The use of the present tense in that first example there is slightly more common in French than it is in English. You do see it quite a lot these days in English literature, but it has been used as a normal narrative tense in French for a while. As you might expect, by using the present tense, it gives a sense of immediacy to the story, as if these things were happening now. Normally, a story will choose either to use the present tense or to use a different one. Joffre's Un sac de billes is slightly unusual in that it mostly uses the present tense, but occasionally slips into this passé simple, un train s'arrêta. If you look carefully at what Joffre is doing, you'll see that he uses the present tense for events which are witnessed by Jo and Maurice, the main characters of the story, and he slips into the passé simple, s'arrêta, for events which are not part of their personal story, events which they've heard about, or information from the narrator about what's going on in the wider war that's going on around them. So we have the immediacy in the present tense, and then we have the passé simple for contextual details beyond their experience. Moving on. On my second slide, we have two examples of the use of the imparfait, the imperfect tense in French literature. So the first one comes once again from Albert Camus' L'Étranger, and I'll read it out to you. Les cinémas du quartier ont déversé dans la rue un flot de spectateurs. Les jeunes filles du quartier, en cheveux, se tenaient par le bras. Les jeunes gens s'étaient arrangés pour les croiser et ils lançaient des plaisanteries dont elles riaient en détournant la tête. So the local cinemas had poured out into the street a flood of spectators. The girls of the district, en cheveux means without hats on, were holding each other by the arm. The young men had worked out how to encounter them, and they were throwing out jokes about which the girls laughed while turning their heads away. And in that paragraph, you see a variety of tenses. We have the normal passé composé, ont déversé, to recount the event that started it. Then we have three imperfect tenses, se tenait, lancer, and rier. And then we have one passé surcomposé, a pluperfect tense in s'était arrangé, because previously the young men had worked out how they were going to accost these young women, and that's why that's one stage further back in the past. Second example from Philippe Grimbert's Un secret. À chacune de mes visites, elle me préparait un chocolat sur le réchaud, je le dégustais à petites gorgées. So on each of my visits, she would make me a hot chocolate on the stove. I would taste it with little sips. And my point here is simply to demonstrate to you that the imperfect tense is used for two distinct functions in a story. When you learn it in school, you generally get told, first of all, that it translates to was doing in English. But in fact, it also very often translates as used to do, would do, or even did. And we can see the two different uses of the imperfect tense in these two examples. In the L'Étranger example, the situation is that Meursault is sitting on his balcony, looking down at the street below, and what we have here is a description of the scene. So there's one event which starts it off. The cinemas pour their spectators out into the streets, and then we are described what is happening, what was happening in the street below. The girls were holding each other by their arms. The boys were throwing out jokes to them. The girls were laughing. So this is not a series of events being recounted in a narrative. This is a description of a state of affairs that was happening, and that's why we have the imperfect tense. In the Grimbert quotation, something slightly different is happening. What's happening here is that at regular intervals, the narrator would go round to his aunt's house, and each time he did, she would make him a hot chocolate and he would sip it as he drank it. So here, it's not a description of a state, but it's narrating something that happened on several occasions. The technical term for it is iterative, because it's repeated actions. So repeated action in the past, something that would happen on more than one occasion, is also a case that requires the imperfect tense in French. Moving on again. So putting these tenses together, my third point is that if you explore the use of tenses closely, it can help you unravel complex chronology. So when a lot of things are happening in a text and you need to work out the order in which they're happening and the way that they relate to each other, if you just stop and look at all the verbs in a passage, look at the tenses that are being used, then you can work out how things fit together. And I've got here the opening lines of Albert Camus' L'Étranger, which offers a very nice example of that. Je prendrai l'autobus à 2 heures et j'arriverai dans l'après-midi. Ainsi, je pourrai veiller et je rentrerai demain soir. J'ai demandé 2 jours de congé à mon patron et il ne pouvait pas me les refuser avec une excuse pareille. Pour le moment, c'est un peu comme si maman n'était pas morte. Après l'enterrement, au contraire, ce sera une affaire classée et tout aura revêtu une allure plus officielle. J'ai pris l'autobus à 2 heures. Il faisait très chaud. So I will take the bus at 2 o'clock and I will get there in the afternoon. He's talking about going to the funeral home where he's just heard that his mother's died. In that way, I'll be able to veiller means to stay up overnight watching over the coffin. So I'll be able to stay up on watch and I will come back home tomorrow evening. I asked for 2 days of leave from my boss and he couldn't refuse them to me with an excuse like that. For the moment, it's a little bit as if mother wasn't dead. After the funeral, on the other hand, it will be a done deal, finished business, and everything will have put on a more official air. I took the bus at 2 o'clock. It was very hot. So you can see there we have a great mix of tenses. In the light brown, we have the future tense, prendrai, arriverai, pourrai, rentrerai. In the green, we have the passé composé, the perfect tense, j'ai demandé, j'ai pris. In the purple, we have the imperfect tense, pouvait, était. In red, we have the present tense, c'est, just that one verb in the middle there. And we also have the rather more unusual dark brown tense, aura revêtu, revêtu. The future in the past. It will have put on a particular air. So by finding the present tense, that c'est at the beginning, we can work out when now is happening. So the present tense in L'Étranger is used for the time at which Meursault is telling his story. As I said earlier, the main tense for telling the story, telling you the events that happened, is in the passé composé, this j'ai demandé, j'ai pris l'autobus. And he's looking back from a time, at some point, after everything has happened. So, this paragraph then is being told from the moment in time of that c'est. At the moment, it's a little bit as if mother wasn't dead. Things that are going to happen in the future, after the time that he's telling you this story, are in the future tense. So after he's told us, after this point that he's telling us, he will take the bus, he will arrive in the afternoon, he will watch over the coffin, and he will come back home the following evening. So we can tell that the story is being told from a point in time before he gets the bus to the funeral home. Things which happened before this c'est are being told in past tenses. Like the passé composé, he asked for leave from his boss, and in a more descriptive way, the boss was not able to refuse them. The situation was that the boss couldn't refuse it. So, in the first paragraph here, what we've got is a timeline that you can reconstitute in which, in the past, he asked for leave from his boss, and the boss wasn't able to refuse it. Now he feels a bit as if his mother isn't dead because he hasn't been through the funeral, and so it doesn't feel quite real yet. And in the future, he's going to get the bus, he's going to go to the funeral home, and then he's going to come home again. What you notice when you start looking at the tenses in detail is that something quite weird happens between the two paragraphs. Because when we get to the next line, the last line here on the screen, you'll see J'ai pris l'autobus à 2 heures, il faisait très chaud. I took the bus at 2 o'clock, it was very hot. So in fact we've got the same line pretty much as we had at the start there, where it said Je prendrai l'autobus, but the tense has changed from I will take the bus at some time after I finish telling you this to I took the bus, meaning that we're now being told the story from a new point in time, sometime after he's taken the bus and gone to the funeral. What Camus is doing here, in fact, is he's concealed a leap in time, that the first part of this passage is told from before the funeral, the second part of the passage is told from after it. And there is at least one other of these kind of jumps in the time of narrating that happens within the course of this story. Why does he do that? My idea is that it's to do with immediacy, that he wants us to feel that we're right there in the story with Meursault, and things are happening almost as we're witnessing them. And so he does this kind of jump in time in order that we can stay very close to the points in time at which things are happening. And again, that fits very well with the meaning of the story, which is about life as unplanned, as disordered, as not really having a meaning or a purpose. And so this sense that we're in there with Meursault, not really knowing what's going to happen next, just as he doesn't know what's going to happen next, is a very fitting way to tell the story. This is my last slide, and it's another example from Philippe Grambert's Un Secret. So to introduce this last passage, Un Secret, if you don't know the story, is a non-fiction memoir by Philippe Grambert about what happened to his parents and their friends during the war when they were Jewish people on the run from the Nazis in occupied France. The story begins with Grambert remembering his childhood when he had an imaginary friend called Simon, who he thought of as a sort of imaginary brother. And then, early on in the story, he discovers that in fact Simon is not so imaginary after all, that in fact there was a child called Simon, who was in fact his half-brother, and that something terrible happened involving his parents during the war, which is the secret of the title. I won't tell you exactly what the secret is, in case you're going to read the book, which I very much recommend. I did speak to a teacher who was teaching this story, and she told me that the point in the story halfway through, when you do actually start to realise what the secret is going to be, her entire class gasped with the realisation of what is about to happen. So that is some encouragement to read the story for yourself. This passage here is just after the terrible event, which is the family secret. Esther et Louise, à peine arrivées, s'étaient effondrées dans les bras de Maxime et de Georges. Elles ne s'étaient senties ni l'une ni l'autre le courage d'évoquer l'acte suicidaire d'Anna et avaient choisi de parler d'une imprudence, d'un oubli. Dans un coin, derrière un fauteuil, on avait déposé les sacs rapportés par Louise et Esther, et ils resteraient fermés sur leurs souvenirs. Couché sur celui de Simon, le petit chien au manteau de tricot veillait sur les affaires de son maître. Esther and Louise, hardly had they arrived, had collapsed into the arms of Maxime and Georges. Neither of them felt the courage to evoke the suicidal act that Hannah had carried out, and they had chosen rather to talk about an imprudence, a forgetfulness. In a corner, behind an armchair, they'd put down the bags brought by Louise and Esther, and they would remain closed on their memories. Lying on Simon's bag, the little dog with a knitted coat was watching over its master's belongings. So Philippe Grimbert does some interesting things with tense in this story. We had an example on the first slide of narration in the past tense as we were talking about the hot chocolate. What he actually does is he switches between past and present tenses in the telling of the story. When he's talking about his own memories of childhood, everything is in the past tense, in the passé simple or in the imparfait. When the story, partway through, changes and becomes the narrative of his parents' generation on the run from the Nazis, it suddenly switches into the present, which is unexpected because obviously we're heading back into the past and you might not expect a switch to the present. But what it does is it suddenly makes everything much more vivid. In the film version of this story, a similar effect is achieved by having all the present day stuff about Grimbert growing up in black and white, and then when we switch back to the story of the occupation and the parents on the run, it explodes into colour. Here, though, we're in the story of the parents' generation on the run, and we're not in the present tense. After telling the whole thing in the present tense, including some very dramatic actions which have just happened just before this passage, suddenly we are in not just a past tense, but the passé surcomposé. We're in the pluperfect tense. They had collapsed. They hadn't felt. They had chosen. They had put down. Why does it change? Not for any reason to do with chronology. It's not that in any sense we've suddenly gone further back into the past. What's happened is we're now in the aftermath. Something has happened, something very dramatic, something terrible, and something which cannot be changed, something which cannot be put right. And in order to express an atmosphere of something which is now irreparable, something which is now insoluble, people who are now at a loss of how they can continue and what they should do now, we switch from the present tense of things going forward to 2 steps back in the past, not just a past tense, but the passé surcomposé, to give an impression that things are now fixed, things are now done, and there's no going back on them. So, those were the points that I wanted to make about the use of tense in narrative. That French stories normally use the present tense, the passé simple, or the passé composé to narrate their stories, and the choice between those 3 can affect how the story feels to the reader. That in past tense narratives, you will also see the use of the imperfect tense, which can be used to describe an ongoing state or to tell you about a repeated action in the past. If you explore the use of tenses in detail, that can help you to fit together complex chronologies and see how various events in the story connect to each other. And lastly, use of tense can sometimes tell us more than when things happen. There can sometimes be stylistic decisions to use a particular tense to express something other than time, as in this feeling of a hopeless aftermath in the Grimbert example that we finished with. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found that useful.